One of the pastors here, and thank you for joining us on this windy, cool summer day. As we are focusing this month on when the godly suffer from the book of Job, we've had opportunity to have some testimonies, and we had testimonies with the baptism service last week, which was very encouraging. And our testimony today is from Angie Frost. And what I've asked, and she'll be sharing about when she had an autoimmune disease, be diagnosed with that when she was in high school. And what I've asked each of the people who are sharing this month to do is tell us what the cause of their suffering was, what some of the questions were they had about themselves and God, what they found helpful, and what have they learned about God and themselves. And my only disclaimer with Angie is I said you can't say anything bad about your parents or your pastor.
All right, can you all hear me good? All right, good morning. Actually, I'm going to put it down a little bit. First, I just wanted to say I will probably not make through this without crying. So first, I wanted to say thank you because a lot of you have prayed me through this journey that I'm about to share, and that you continue to pray for me all the time. And my family and I deeply feel those prayers, and I appreciate them so much. So here we go. I was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease called lupus when I was 18 years old. I was a senior in high school, and I started experiencing severe joint pain and swelling in every joint in my body, along with other symptoms of just skin rashes and really low energy. I had never heard of lupus, and they explained that my immune system was overactive and attacking my body. They said that most likely I would suffer from chronic fatigue, arthritis, skin rashes from sun exposure, and that it could potentially attack an internal organ as well. This is something I would deal with the rest of my life with no known cure. I started heavy doses of meds, including steroids, so I was not a pleasant person to live with, if you know what it's like to be on steroids, and I didn't really feel like myself either. Really like myself, and I was seeing doctors at least every other week, if not more, and getting labs done weekly. I got thrown into a world that I had never dealt with. I remember distinctly going into waiting rooms and being angry because everyone there was 60 to 90 years old, and I'm wondering why God allowed me to deal with this at such a young age. 2 months into the diagnosis, I was hospitalized for a massive flare-up. My body just went completely out of balance with inflammation. I don't think there was a spot of me that didn't have some form of inflammation going on. And I was admitted to the ICU and had a extended hospital stay. The appointment after my release from the hospital, they told me that things usually get a lot worse before they get better, and that was true for me. She told me that the lupus had attacked my kidneys and that they were functioning at about 25%, and they would have to do a very aggressive treatment to try to save them. And then she broke the news that I would be getting chemotherapy, and I was in shock. I would wake up in the morning hoping it was all a bad dream and not my reality. So I did the rounds of chemo with several hiccups. My anti-nausea medicine ended up causing panic attacks and insomnia for days after my treatment until they figured out that my body was reacting that way. And obviously, I just didn't feel well physically at all while trying to be a carefree senior in high school. It was at this point they also told me that there was a high chance that the chemo would cause infertility, which broke my heart because I always wanted to be a mom. That time period is a blur of pain and grief as I was grieving the loss of the life I thought I'd have. I was extremely active, a runner, loved being outdoors, but now potentially would have sun sensitivity, joint pain, and consistent fatigue. On top of that, my dream of having a family someday seemed bleak. I legitimately could not imagine a man wanting to marry a girl who potentially could not have kids and would be a burden both financially and physically from the get-go. I grieved my future at a time in life that I should have been the most excited. I got very angry at God, and I remember my dad told me that it was okay to be angry, but to not stay angry, and while I was angry, to make sure that I kept talking to God. And I did. I screamed at God, I sobbed with God, and I wrestled with God, but in the same sense, I felt like he was the only one I could talk to that would get it. Denise Heesh, who was the youth pastor's wife at the time, I had met with her, and I'll never forget, she looked at me and she said, Angie, you have to decide for yourself if God is all that's left in your life, is he enough? And I wrestled with the question because initially it didn't feel like he was. I went to college still angry, not going to church or really actively living my faith, and a friend asked me to go to church. And the pastor preached on Abraham offering Isaac and having to trust God, even though he wouldn't know how God would fulfill his promises. And the pastor asked the question, what do you feel God is asking you to sacrifice today? And for where I was at the time, I felt like he was asking me to give up my life of health and the life I always thought I'd have. He said, the pastor said, God knows the end of your story, just like he knew Abraham's. Do you trust him with it? And I rededicated my life that day, even though I still didn't know the why. Well, more than 15 years has passed since I was that angry, confused 18-year-old girl crying out to God. I now view lupus as the greatest blessing in my life because it led me to know Jesus at a level I never would have. Honestly, although suffering physically is awful and messes with you mentally and emotionally, and I still question God's plan at certain times, my times of suffering are my most precious moments with God, and I long for it. He turned a very anxious girl who always wanted to know what would happen next and had a plan for her entire life and broke me of the control I thought I had, and I view life so differently because of it. I'm slower to question God's goodness when something bad happens, and I have hope for now for how he might use it for his glory. I notice myself praying that his will be done, because in his will is the best place to be, even if it involves more suffering. Although in the last 15 years, I've been reminded daily of my disease, either through the symptoms of lupus or the unpleasant side effects of medication, I have seen blessing upon blessing. Let me name a few. 2 healthy boys who God is also molding by having a mother with a chronic disease. A husband who loves me where I'm at, but pushes me to see the goodness of God's plan during hard times. And the ability to connect to women at my business who have chronic diseases, and I'm able to share that my faith is what sustains me. The endless ways that science does not explain why my body continues to bounce back after every flare-up I have encountered. God is so good. I was gifted this journal on my wedding day and the book 1000 Gifts. The idea is every day to write something that you are thankful for, a gift. When I'm going through a hard time, I reread this and am reminded even more of how blessed I am, and it changes my perspective. I'm going to end with something I wrote 3 years ago after going through another massive flare in my kidneys and going through all of the same awful treatments. I wrote this in my hospital bed, where some of my deepest moments have happened with the Lord. 14 years ago, I sat in a hospital bed just like this, undergoing similar treatments. 18 years old and scared out of my mind and angry at a God I didn't think loved me, confused why he would allow this to happen to me. Fast forward, and here I am again today. A lupus flare, kidney biopsy, physical pain, steroids, tests, treatments. But my heart is in such a different place. Sad, yes. Disappointed, yes. Hard, yes. But not angry, not afraid. You see, because of the past 14 years, I know God different, better. Loving, compassionate, gracious, peace giver, faithful, powerful, and healer. Ways I never would have understood fully if I hadn't had to question God's goodness and truly come to the realization that God is good, no matter my circumstances. He uses hard times to remind me that I am weak and he is strong, that I'm not in control, thank goodness, and that's how it should stay. It gives God the opportunity to do miracles, things science can't explain, and I get to witness. Truly blessed. Lupus is a disease that has messed up my life in a beautiful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. There are still times today happened this morning when she walked in. I start choking up. In his book, Tim Keller, about walking with God through pain and suffering, he says this book is for sufferers, but I want to make some distinctions. We are all sufferers, or will be. But for those who are not in it right now and watching it in others, we have a host of philosophical, social, psychological, moral questions about it. But for those who are in it, the philosophical questions are there. Why, Lord? But the real concern is, how am I going to survive another day? And they're completely different questions. And so from Angie in our lives, it's uniquely her experience, and it's very different from us, but it is also a central part of my wife and I and our story, because we all, in some ways, identify. And actually, for everyone who's going to share their story this month, it's affected all of us, because we're the church. We're their church. And we experience it in different ways, but we still experience suffering. And we want, when we know the godly people who are suffering, they're part of us, and we care. And we want to get better at caring, which is part of the reason we're doing this series on the book of Job. We don't want to be like Job's friends, who have these cookie-cutter theological lessons. You know, somebody could have said to Job, God could have said to Job, you know, after this is all said and done, 3,000 years later, they're still going to be talking about you as a great example of handling suffering. I'm not sure that would have helped him at the moment. It would have been true. And yet in all of the swirl of Job's counsel, there are some very timeless principles. And we can prepare for suffering by listening to and learning from the testimonies of those who have suffered. And Job is the most famous. But we all know other people who have and even are in this audience today, suffering. So we're looking at Job. I invite you to turn with me to Job 13. And we're looking at when godly people suffer. And we saw a few weeks ago the first response when godly people suffer is they hold fast by faith to what they already claim to believe about God. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. And we learn that what they need from their friends is godly presence, faithful presence. Not a lot of answers. But they also need more than that. Where is hope? So I want to highlight again today some of Job's laments and draw some lessons about what the Bible teaches us about finding hope when the godly suffer. Remember, Job 4 to 31 are like 3 cycles of conversation between his 3 friends and himself, and Job has 8 response speeches, not including the opening speech of chapter 3. And he's addressing his friends, complaining about what bad advice they're giving, and he's also lamenting, which is a nice word for saying he's whining and complaining to God about what happened. And I believe the swirl of his conversation shows the agonizing process of suffering. And it is an agonizing process. And searching for hope. What is hope? Where is it found? What is he hoping for? And who ultimately brings hope? So, what is hope? Well, there are a couple of Hebrew words in our passages today that talk about where hope is, what hope is. Maybe the most common, and hope, by the way, occurs, as you would expect in a book on suffering, more than 24 times. And the most common word for hope is what we'll see in chapter 14, verse 7 and verse 19. It means to wait or to look for with eager expectation. The verb form in chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him, is the word which means to wait or to hope for. One theological dictionary says it is the expectation of a believer which is clearly linked to faith and trust, with a result of patient waiting. But it may not feel very patient, and you may not feel very patient. So this means that hope is not a pacifying daydreams where you can abandon reality and get away from it all. It is not something that is uncertain. It's not a wish. It is a solid ground of expectation directed toward God. What is hope? And one of the principles we learn from that is that hope often entails waiting. One of the principles that a book that was referred to me by Leanne, Pastor Neil actually gave it to me for my birthday, is a book by Mark Vergop called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. One of the principles he draws from lament is that waiting is not a waste. There's something going on while you wait, but it's really hard. Hope is the sustaining value during suffering. If you've heard of the studies of people who have been in prison, Nazi war camps or Nazi death camps, and the role of hope for those who had hope and those who didn't have hope, and how the presence of hope makes a huge difference on how they endure. So loss refines hope. And as you read through the book of Job, and I encourage you to keep reading and rereading it this month, notice Job's hope and how it changes. What will satisfy? What is he looking for? What will satisfy him? And think, what can you learn about suffering through his testimony? Well, obviously there are different kinds of hope. One that's really relevant to me right now this morning is I hope my notes don't blow away. I hope the tent doesn't blow down. And I hope we don't. And things like that about the weather and drought. And obviously those are way different kinds of hope than I hope that God is there. Way different kinds of hope. They're objects of hope. And at first Job would have had what many of us would say was the ideal life, what we hope for. Happiness and prosperity. A great family. But where is hope when that's gone? That can't be our hope. Initially, as you read the laments of Job, he seems to hope for death because his hope seems to be gone. I wish I could die, he says a number of times, chapter 6, verse 8, chapter 7. But then in this passage, Job 13, if you have a Bible, I invite you to turn there with me. We have one of the most famous verses of Job. And remember, his friends have been talking. And he says, verse 13, keep silent and let me speak. Then let come to me what may. Why do I put myself in jeopardy and take my life in my hands? Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And take my life, and I will surely defend my ways to his face. Indeed, this will turn out for my deliverance, for no godless man would dare to come before him. Listen carefully to my words. Let your ears take in what I say. Now that I've prepared my case, I know that I will be vindicated. Can anyone bring charges against me? If so, I will be silent and die. Now this text in verse 15, there has a couple of different options in the Hebrew. One is positive, as the NIV translates it. Though he slay me, yet will I hope. There is another reading in the Hebrew that is more negative. Most of our margins have that. He will surely slay me. I have no hope. Yet will I trust him. Yet will I defend my ways. The negative version is a little bit more accurate. We don't like to hear that. But it means we shouldn't minimize the degree of Job's distress. He is nearly losing hope. If God slays me, so I have no hope. And however we translate it, the context requires an emphasis on hope, not doubt. He's saying, I still believe, even if he almost slays me, I'll still believe I'll have an opportunity to talk to him. Or even if there is no hope, I still have the nerve to insist on, I want an opportunity to talk to God about this. So what is he hoping for? Well, he's hoping there for deliverance and vindication. Two interrelated concepts. Indeed, verse 16, this will turn out for my deliverance. The Hebrew word is Yeshua, from which we get names like Joshua or Jesus. It is the word for salvation, the most common word for salvation in the Old Testament. This is a salvation that usually comes from God. It's usually it's a salvation from external events like a tornado, being saved from a tornado, or being saved from enemy attacks. Sometimes it has what we think of in the New Testament is the spiritual idea of salvation, eternal salvation. But at one level, then Job is saying, I just want relief from circumstances, from my pain. That's my hope. But he also, in his reference to the godless man standing before God, indicates that he hopes to be godly, that he is godly, and that because of that, he will actually be able to stand before God face to face. So he's hoping for deliverance, he's hoping for vindication. This is a very common word for the righteous man. Verse 18, I know that I will be vindicated, I'll be seen as righteous. This is kind of a courtroom setting. A lot of the conversations in Job sounds like a courtroom. I just want to have somebody to present my case to. And he says, now that I've prepared my case, I know that I will be vindicated. He's very frustrated, as we've seen a couple weeks ago. His frustration is building with his friends because he keeps saying, I'm innocent. Same word that's translated innocent in chapter 9. But I can't prove it with God. I can't prove myself with God. And your theology, you well-intentioned friends, is not helpful. And actually, it's not right because you're assuming that the reason you have a good life is because you're more righteous than I am. That's bad theology. I wish I could just vindicate myself so you would know. So he's hoping for deliverance and vindication because he hasn't done anything that this should happen to him. By the way, there are 3 or 4 different kinds of suffering. Keller makes this point in his book. There's Jonah and David and the suffering we bring on ourselves because we've sinned. It's obvious. You sinned, something bad happened. There's the suffering of Paul and Jeremiah and the suffering of betrayal or persecution when bad people do things to us or against us. And there's the Mary and Martha in the suffering of loss, grief. We'll hear stories of that, and some of you are experiencing that kind of suffering today. And then there's Job and the mystery of suffering. Not because of sin, not because somebody is doing bad things to him, not because somebody has died, but because he's suffering. Maybe the most common kinds of suffering like that today are lifelong diseases or depression. Where did that come from? Why? So Job initially is hoping to die. He's hoping for deliverance and vindication in these verses. But notice by the end of the 3rd cycle of speeches, if you read through it again, Job is not so concerned about vindication, about being seen as innocent. Probably because by the end of it, that's not really that important. And by the way, he knows his friends who keep telling him he must have done something wrong. They don't know what they're talking about, and I'm not going to listen to them anyway. And fortunately, they stop talking. So what he hopes for is changing. And where he looks for is changing. The reality is, it feels like God is killing him, though he slay me. And then he goes on the end of chapter 13, so man wastes away like something rotten, like a garment eaten by moths. And we see this theme over and over. If we're going to die anyway, maybe God could just leave me alone. Because we're all going to die. And then in the middle of this, if you want to look in chapter 14, verse 13, it's tucked in the middle of two metaphors about hope. Chapter 14, verse 7, is the metaphor of a tree. At least there is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will sprout again, and its new shoots will not fail. And then the other metaphor, right after the passage we want to look at, is the metaphor of a mountain, verse 18 and 19. But as the mountain erodes and crumbles, and as the rocks is moved from its place, as water wears away stones and torrents wash away the soil, so you destroy man's hope. But in the middle of that, there's this glimmer of hope for something beyond this life when God remembers him. If only you would hide me in the grave. Again, there's that death wish a little bit. And conceal me till your anger has passed. If only you would set me a time and remember me. I want you, God, to remember me. You will call, if a man dies, will he live again? All the days of my hard service I will wait. There's that word hope. I will hope for my renewal to come. You will call and I will answer. You will long for the creature your hands have made. Surely then you will count my steps, but not keep track of my sin. My offenses will be sealed up in a bag. You will cover over my sins. See, Job is not saying he's sinless. He's not saying that, but he is saying in regard to what causes suffering, I'm innocent. And I'm longing for the day when sin won't even be an issue. You see, there's this glimmer of hope for something beyond this life. He dreams of life after death. He hopes for life after death. The word renewal there in verse 14, I will wait, I will hope for my renewal to come, is a military metaphor for describing how you would feel after you retired from 25 years of service for the United States Army. Or how you would feel after you've been deployed to the Mideast and you come home and you have several months of furlough. It's a renewal. It's a relief. Literally, it means a change or revival. There's a hint here of hope for revival after death. So he's saying, even if I die, I will hope for when I can talk to God. And I will call, and you will call, I will answer. We'll have this interaction. I will hope for when I can see him. There is this dream, this hint of a hope of life after death. But still, the reality seems awful grim, because as the mountain erodes and crumbles and the rock is moved from its place, as the water wears away stones and torrents wash away the soil, you destroy man's hope. And he's still living in this swirl of agony and suffering. Chapter 17 is another response to one of his friends' advice, and he's still holding on to his righteousness. The reality is very grim. Sorry, my Bible's going to fly away. Last passage I want to look at is chapter 19. In the middle of this swirl of agony, ongoing swirl of agony and grieving, we led up to this a couple of weeks ago. He's feeling alienated from God. He's feeling isolated from anybody who should care. But no matter what, he hopes for future justification, even if he dies. So verse 23, Job 19. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. Just in case I die, I want to have a permanent written record so that I can be proven that I was righteous. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. He hopes for a living Redeemer. The word Redeemer has a rich Old Testament heritage. It describes a relative who makes sure that a widow's rights are taken care of. It describes a relative who makes sure that justice is taken care of if somebody is murdered. God is often called a redeemer in the Old Testament. It goes back to when he redeemed them, when he rescued them from Egypt. So Job's only ultimate hope is that God will see and God will do what is good and right. This is not a full-blown doctrine of the resurrection, but it's more than a hope that it's going to be resolved because while he's still living. Because, by the way, the hope that it will be resolved while I'm still alive is not good enough when you're at a funeral, because death has already happened. And it's not good enough if you have a diagnosis of a terminal illness. And there is no guarantee in the midst of suffering that they will all live happily ever after in this life. So Job hopes for beyond that, a living Redeemer. And notice the emphasis in those words, in those verses. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God with my own eyes. There's an emphasis on seeing, skin, flesh, eyes. He will have this experience as a human, not a disembodied ghost, or just in his mind's imagination. So where is hope? Where's your hope? It's not in family and prosperity. He already had that. It's not in good and godly friends, as well-intentioned as our friends and family may be. One of the things that our Angie said, she realized, I have to do this by myself. Mom and Dad, there's some things you can't do. She never said that. But there's some things that you can only do with you and God. And family and friends, well-intentioned advice can only go so far. So where's hope? Is your hope an answered prayer here and now? Is your hope in being proved right here and now? Job's friends think that hope comes from living a righteous life. So if you just live a righteous life, then that's your hope. But Job has a righteous life. And when godly people like Job suffer, they ultimately get to chapter 19, verse 25. My only hope is a living Redeemer. And Joseph Bailey, in his book I referenced a couple weeks ago, The View from a Hearse, who buried 3 boys at different ages, said that the paradox is that when you accept the fact of death, you're free to live. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. Our only ultimate hope is a face-to-face living relationship with a living Redeemer God. We can only have that, as you know from the New Testament. We can only have that living relationship through God's Son, Jesus Christ, who is the one who came to ransom us, same kind of word as redeem us, from the penalties of our sin and the consequences of our life on earth and the frailty of our life on earth. And he freed us from eternal death. So though he slay me, though I die, I still have hope. Because my hope is not in here and now. It is in the living Redeemer God. So what can we learn from the testimonies of those who suffer? One commentator says about Job, slowly but surely it emerges that the purpose of Job's suffering is an enlarged life with God. And only through the point of suffering can you actually say that suffering is a blessing. So what are some convictions and disciplines of faith that help or have helped in times of suffering? Listen to the testimonies. Listen to the testimonies of people in our church, your friends. Listen to the testimony of Job. And what are some of the convictions that help us in times of suffering? One of them I already mentioned is waiting is not a waste. Hang on to that. Another one in his book on Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy is keep turning to prayer. Mark Vergraf says, and Angie mentioned this, keep talking to God. He quotes James Montgomery Boyce, who was a pastor for 32 years at one church. He said, "It is better to ask spiritual questions than not to ask them, because asking them sharpens the issue and pushes us toward the right positive response." Alexander McLaren writes, "Doubts are better put into plain speech than lying, diffused and darkening like poison's mists in our hearts. A thought, whether it's good or bad, can be dealt with when it's spoken." Keep talking to God. Keep turning to God in prayer. Verkop goes on to say, "I wonder how many believers stop speaking to God about their pain. Disappointed by unanswered prayers or frustrated by out-of-control circumstances, these people wind up in a spiritual desert, unable or refusing to talk to God. This silence is a soul killer." What are convictions that will help us? Keep turning to prayer. Dare to hope. Pay no attention to that stand. Dare to hope while life is hard. He writes, lament dares to hope while life is hard. Lament is a prayer of faith despite your fear. And he's quoting from Lamentations, Mark Vergop. He says, Lamentations shows us that hope does not come from a change of circumstances. It comes from what you know to be true despite the situation in front of you. In other words, you live through suffering by what you believe, not by what you see or feel. Dare to hope while life is hard. Waiting is not a waste. Keep turning to God in prayer. Because notice this, it's not over yet for Job. I mean, this goes on for another 14, 15 chapters. Chapter 23, again, he still wants an audience with God to prove that he's upright. And remember, that's what he was described as at the beginning of the book. Blameless and upright. He still wants to prove it. He still wants to talk with God. But meantime, he's holding on. And we see that suffering is refining hope, which is another conviction that we can hang on to when we suffer. C.S. Lewis famously said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. Suffering refines our hope. Keller goes on to say about that, quote, believers understand many doctrinal truths in the mind, but those truths seldom make the journey down into the heart, except through disappointment, failure, and loss. As a man who seemed about to lose both his career and his family once said to me, I always knew in principle that Jesus is all you need to get through, but you don't really know Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. Suffering refines our hope. And one of you in the middle of suffering recently told me that since this happened, the word is more vivid. And you can't explain why. But suffering refines hope. Because last conviction I just want to suggest is the conviction that God will be enough. What is a great moral of Job's story is that when godly people suffer, they will find hope. You don't have to find it. You don't have to search for it. When godly people suffer, they will find hope in the living God, the Redeemer. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the lessons of suffering that some have experienced very, very, very firsthand. Some are experiencing right now, and they're in the middle of it and just need to somehow get through it. I pray that Job's words would help them express the agony they feel, the questions that they have. But Job's testimony would also help them to see hope, find hope in you. Thank you that we can lament honestly before you. And we can know that you're big enough to hear our questions and our cries and our prayers. But above all, you are big enough to believe and to hope. And we thank you that you are enough. And pray that we will walk by faith in times of suffering. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.